Hey, Fellowship Kids team. Autumn here to talk to you about the lesson that we'll be teaching in our Fellowship Kids classes this coming Sunday, March 17th. This is Easter month. And so, all month long through our lessons, we are walking with Jesus and the disciples through Jerusalem towards Jesus' crucifixion and resurrection. On March 4th, we talked about Jesus going to the temple and driving out the money changers. On March 10th, we talked about Jesus sharing the Last Supper or the Passover meal with his disciples. Significant because in the Passover, the Israelites remember their deliverance from Egypt. And when we take communion, which is what Jesus links that practice to, we remember Jesus' sacrifice on our behalf. This week, we'll talk about Jesus standing trial before Pilate. Then on March 24th, we'll talk about Jesus' crucifixion, and 31st, which is Easter, we'll celebrate Jesus' resurrection together. So this week, our lesson is from Mark 15, 1 through 15. At this point in the story, Judas had betrayed Jesus. The Jewish authorities came and bound Jesus and took him and held their own trial. They found him guilty, but because they were ruled by Rome and Jerusalem was under Roman occupation, the Jewish leaders didn't have legal authority to try and sentence Jesus. So they took him to Pilate, who was like a regional governor who had been placed there by the Roman rulers to oversee this area. And they were hoping that Pilate would be able to sentence Jesus to death. Pilate saw through their scheme, their plan, and their concocted charges. But as he questioned Jesus, Jesus wouldn't speak, and he refused to defend himself. So Pilate then turns to the crowd and tries a sort of ploy to see if, because Pilate, we know, his conscience was uneasy, and he wasn't convinced that Jesus was guilty. And he knew that the charges that were being brought against him had been part of this scheme, that they were concocted. But the crowd yells out that they want Barabbas to be released and Jesus to be crucified. And so Pilate gives in. He's concerned about continuing disruption in his area. He doesn't want that to get up the chain, as it were, and get back to Rome. So he gives the people what they want. He turns Jesus over to be crucified. Now, the story, as it's told in our lessons this week, is great. It walks through the passage. It tells main points of the story and helps our kids imagine what was taking place in this account in Mark 15. There are a couple of things that I want you, as our teachers, to notice and to think about, to meditate on as you get ready to teach this to our kids this week. And the first is this, that Jesus came preaching and teaching about this different sort of kingdom. One that was full of people who would love really differently, love in a really active way, who would live differently, live in a way that had different values with integrity, that they would give up striving after power and popularity and position, that they wouldn't adhere to the power structures present in society around them, and they would worship differently. Ultimately, Jesus called himself a temple and set up this pattern that they would understand themselves as temples in the sense that they would represent God's presence to the rest of the world. And Jesus opened this kingdom to everyone, Jews and Gentiles, who would repent and follow him. And in this passage in Mark, he dies at the hands of both Jews and Gentiles, or by the proclamation of both Jews and Gentiles. And he dies for everyone there, for Pilate, for the Roman soldiers, for the Jews and Gentiles present, and we know for all of humanity, to reconcile them to himself and to each other. And then our big idea this week in our lesson is we can choose Jesus. This is good for our kids to understand, especially in the context of our story from last week and our story from this week. Judas chose to betray Jesus, and many people in the crowd shouted out for Jesus to be crucified. The Jewish leaders didn't choose Jesus. Pilate ultimately didn't choose Jesus. But in these accounts in the Gospels, and then as the story continues into Acts, we also can read about many people who did choose Jesus and the rest of the disciples who went on to continue to tell his story. So I love this big idea this week. We can choose Jesus. Each of our kids, I hope that that idea sinks into their hearts, that Jesus did come for them, that he gave his life as a sacrifice for them and for us, that we remember that as we're preparing. And ultimately, that we can not follow in the pattern of the angry crowd and the Jewish leaders and come up with our own schemes, but to choose Jesus and the way of his kingdom.